Welcome back to That Was the Week That Was, week 17 of 2023. And once again, I'm here with Vince, looking at the past week through the lens of the Alternative Centre. Hey, Vince, how are you today?
Hi, Bob. I'm doing all right. It's nice and warm here in Nelson still, so I'm glad that the winter hasn't quite come yet.
Well, let's just jump straight into it.
Yep.
On Wednesday, Xi phoned Zelensky, and they have now established bilateral relations. So it looks like something new might be happening there. What's your take?
I think the Chinese have realised that they can push themselves into a position of world leadership if they become the side that brokers peace in Ukraine. I think they've realised that the Americans aren't willing to do it. The Americans don't want peace. They want more war. The Americans are so beholden to the globalists that they just want Ukraine to drain Russia to the maximum possible extent. They don't actually want peace. They want both sides to destroy each other. So the Chinese, I think, have realised that they've got an opportunity now to become the world's peace brokers. And if they can manage that, they'll really be the leading force in the whole world in general.
And Xi seems to have gained in stature with his own people. They're seeing him as being the responsible one here.
He's gained hugely. The Chinese Communist Party still has very high support among their own people. Contrast that with Joe Biden, who is just this week it came out that he's actually polling lower than any American president has ever polled, on 37% approval. So the Chinese system appears to have a lot more legitimacy in the eyes of its own people than what the American one does, and by extension, the globalist system.
Incredible. Clown world.
Yeah, it's clown world, right?
All right, so Vince, my next question to you is about immigration, and more specifically, the growth of the Australian migrant population by 700,000 people since their borders reopened. The Alt Centre is highly critical of migration like this, isn't it?
The Alternative Centre is highly critical of mass immigration of cheap labour, particularly because it drives down wages and pushes up housing. And it's ironic to us that those who oppose immigration are often characterised as far-right extremists, because the far right, in New Zealand at least, is the ACT Party, and they want to import as much cheap labour as possible. The same deal is happening in Australia. Australia is beholden to globalist interests, and what globalists want are just as much cheap labour as possible. So the Australians, even though that Anthony Albanese is apparently a Labor Party Prime Minister, so he's supposedly on working on the sides of the working class of Australia, he's importing as much cheap labour as he thinks he can get away with. The really sad thing about that is that Australians have been warned to brace for a spike in homelessness. So I think the ruling class is aware that they're causing suffering to their own people by importing so much cheap labour. They just don't care at all. It's a similar situation in New Zealand, similar in America, and similar in Europe. The entire Western world is under the thrall of these globalists who want nothing more than just more cheap labour.
It really is amazing. Vince, I cannot believe it.
It's hard to believe, especially when you think about how much destruction these policies are actually causing among the people of those who are supposedly being governed.
The actual citizens, yeah.
Yeah, it's horrific.
Okay, well, there's more disparity and more unfairness. Here in New Zealand, we learned last week that the New Zealand rich are paying 9.4% tax, while the average man in the street is paying a whopping 20.2%. And in the wake of these statistics being released, the Greens are calling for a wealth tax again. But this is now something that the Alt Centre opposes.
The difficulty, I think, is that the horse is bolted when it comes to the possibility of a capital gains tax. New Zealand is just about the only country in the entire OECD that doesn't have a comprehensive capital gains tax. And the time for us to introduce one was really about 10 years ago, before housing started to explode in price. But it's too late now. Those profits have been cashed, so they won't be taxed. But there's always the possibility of a wealth tax. As an alternative centrist, I'm not so much against wealth taxes because I believe that it's better than having income taxes. It's better that people with more money than they need get taxed than the average worker at the bottom. Just a reminder, the average worker in New Zealand is taxed from the first dollar they earn, which is different to Australia and different to Britain, where you can make about $20,000 tax-free before the tax man comes after you. So in New Zealand, workers already have one of the lowest standards of living in the entire OECD. We're taxed from the first dollar. I wouldn't have any problem with a wealth tax if it was balanced by a tax-free threshold for the average worker. That wouldn't upset me as an alt-centrist at all.
Ah, awesome. Interesting. Okay, I didn't realize that. I thought that you were against redistribution of wealth.
The alternative centre is more about reducing the suffering of humanity. So if redistribution of wealth can achieve this, then the alternative centre isn't against it. What the alternative centre is against is the politics of envy, which is taking down the rich specifically because they're rich. We're not necessarily in favour of that. But if redistribution of wealth would help society in general, we're not against that either. So we're sort of have to assume a nuanced and balanced position.
In the last 10 years, I have heard more about treason than in the entire rest of my life. Last week, you could have totally knocked me down with a feather when I came across an article from Counterspin Media suggesting that we have treason trials in New Zealand in the wake of the revelations that Pfizer knew very early on that their vaccine was ineffective. Vince, is there any possibility of this, or is it just the current fad to call for treason trials?
I think there's never been this much discontent among the New Zealand people at their ruling class before. I'm all favour of treason trials. I'm all in favour of the ruling class getting decapitated because I think it's honestly what they deserve. Although I'm not so worried about the Pfizer jabs, as I don't think the vaccine mandates come anywhere near the amount of total damage caused by the war on drugs or the amount of total damage caused by the mass immigration of cheap labour. I think both of those things are 100 times worse than the vaccine mandates. And I think if you consider all these things together, it's more than sufficient reason that the ruling class be tried with treason. Of course, they're not going to try themselves with treason. So the people are going to have to come together in order to do this. But of course, there are innumerable obstacles between the people coming together and actually achieving any political power, not least of which is the 5% threshold, which has successfully kept all challenges to power out of Parliament for 30 years now. So I don't know how it would be possible to actually action that. But I think the main thing is to just raise awareness that what's been done to us is extremely evil and unforgivable. And I'm glad that Counterspin Media are on the forefront of that.
Yes, absolutely. It's good that somebody is talking up about alternatives.
It's good that somebody's talking about it instead of just submission, which is what you get out of New Zealanders in general. We're so happy to just roll over and take any amount of abuse. It's really disgraceful. So it's a nice thing to see that somebody's willing to try and stand up.
Well, another hard week, and we have come to the end of the show. So let us leave our show on a high tonight. It has been reported in America that the citizens of that country have spent $30 billion on weed in 2022. That's some smoking. They must have really needed it.
It's a lot of money. That's over $100 per citizen. So it's a lot, especially when you combine it with the fact that cannabis use is replacing alcohol use and tobacco use to a major extent, especially among young people. I think if you just measure those younger than 30, they already use more cannabis than alcohol. So I think those trends are going to continue throughout the age brackets as people get older. And I think it won't be long. I think the report you mentioned actually predicts that cannabis sales will outstrip alcohol sales within about 5 or 10 years. So I think what we're seeing is people are finally waking up. They're finally coming back to reason and they're finally appreciating that cannabis as a recreational drug doesn't have anywhere near as many drawbacks as what booze does. So I think that'll continue. I can only hope that it'll wake people in New Zealand up, and we'll realise that we're just losing from cannabis prohibition here, particularly because it forces people to use alcohol if they want to use a recreational drug.
At least we have some good news going forward into next week, but what a week that was.
Yep, cheers, Bob. It was an interesting week, all right. And we see the same trends that have been working in previous weeks continuing to work. I think we'll see an interesting week next week.
The alt centre are clown world's good guys. They don't fit into boxes neatly enough to be someone else's tools.